We'll begin rendering our geometric shapes with the cube. It's the most natural place to start because it has the simplicity of flat planes that we can put a gradation of value on. Before you start, you're going to take a quarter sheet of your 14 by 17 inch paper and outline your geometric shape, outline your square. Also have a scrap of marker paper nearby so that you can try out your markers on it before you begin. But to prepare the box, you need to do that carefully. You can be sure that these pigment liners won't bleed when you put your marker over top, your gray marker over top. You have a different brand, but they'll work just as easily as mine do. Outline just the outer square with your pigment liner. Inside, use a 30% gray marker, but leave a gap, leave a tunnel of white. That's going to be the corner of our box. So you want to leave that open and white as you can. We can always use our white pencil to clean it up later, but it's better to leave it white right now. Before you do anything, go back to the chart that we made in class. Now, we have separated our values into 3 categories. A for the light, B for the halftone, and C for the shadow. On each of our objects, you can see all of this in play. So on our cube, the top of the box is getting the most light. So that means that you're going to wet the paper mostly with the number 1 marker. And then you're going to introduce a little bit of number 3. The front of the box is oblique to the light, so it's a halftone. And the markers we're going to use there are the 3 and the 5. And the 3 is going to be most of what we use. And then we're going to introduce a little bit of 5. The shadows, on the other hand, are C, and they're mostly 5. With a little bit of 7. And that's the same for all of our objects. And we'll look at them individually. But we're interested in the box right now, so we know, going by our chart, exactly what markers go where and how to put, and we'll just look at how to put that on. Okay, so I've left my areas of white that I intend to leave white. I've got a stack of paper underneath me to absorb my ink. And just like in class, we're going to start with our darkest values first. That way, we can set up how dark it's going to go and know how much lighter to leave the lights. If you start with the lights, sometimes it's difficult to judge whether they're light enough. You might make them too dark. That'll become more evident the more rendering that you do. So we need our, just as our map showed us, the cast shadow is going to be made up of the number 5 marker and the number 7 marker. So we're going to get it, we've got an X here on the 5, so we're going to get the paper wet with the 5 and introduce some 7. And with your markers, it's best to start in the area where you know you want it to be the darkest. Remember, this surface is all lit up. So there's light bouncing off the surface and it's hitting here on this shadow side of the box. So the darkest part is up here at the top and along this side. So when we finish here, we'll jump into the box. And we want to make a distinction between the two, and that's going to help us. If it's just a little bit lighter here than the shadow that's being cast by it, that will help to separate the two. So you need to keep both of your markers open at the same time for the whole procedure, for both of those shadows. So make it possible for you to turn your page any which way you need to in order to get this to work. So I'm going to start with the 5, and I'm going to start here because I know that the cast shadow is darkest right up against the form. And make sure to do a paper check before you start. Make sure you're using the paper that will give you the darkest rendition of your markers, the most smooth and dark rendition. with your markers. There's one side that's meant to repel the ink so that it won't bleed, but that's not very helpful when what we're doing is a blended technique, and that's the technique we're working with this week. We'll try other ones, but this one is the most forgiving, and it makes it possible to do what we're after here. So I'm going back in now with my 7, and it was a little bit drier, so I've got some marks that I may want to blend in. So I can take the 5 now and work back in and try to blend that in so it's not too blotchy. My markers are fairly new though, so it's going to, I just have to wait now, leave it and see what happens. Better not to mess with it too much. Okay, now my goal here on this side is to go from dark to light this way. I went from dark to light that way. I'm going from dark to light this way, and I'll turn my page again just to make sure that I've got the best chance of going up to that line and not going too much past it, not to get a furry line or a jaggedy line. And this paper is thin, so you gotta practice picking it up quickly so that it doesn't all dry out on you before you can do the next part. That dried, so I just went right over it again and re-wet it. That's the great thing about alcohol-based markers. You can re-wet the paper up to a certain point. At some point it's not going to let me do that anymore, and I'll just be making stains. But notice how much darker this gets. Every time I lay the marker on it, it's getting just a little bit darker. Okay, making sure the front is nice and wet now. And I'll introduce the 7 right at the top. And I can kind of swoosh it down. Then I'll blend it in a little bit with my 5. And then I leave it alone. I can see it kind of puddling a little bit, so I've got to just leave it alone. I don't like this line, but I shouldn't touch it, but I'm going to anyway. Okay. Now, it'd be best to let that dry before you tackle the next part, because if you don't, you're going to get your hand on it. And if you get your hand on it while it's wet, it will lift up the ink. Okay, so that was 5 and 7 for our shadow sides. Now our middle value side, our halftone, is a combination of 5 and 3. So I'm going to use those to get this going. Now my idea behind this one is that the light is bouncing up here, all in here. So I'm going to take my 3 all the way across, but my 5 will only be up around here, where this reflected light from the surface can't really catch it, or can't catch it very well. So both your lids off, and be careful putting your lids back on. You can damage your nib. They're difficult to get off. It takes some practice, but if you twist a little bit, I think that helps. So here I am with my 30. This time I'm going to start out this way. And this is the darkest part. That's 30 up. Check your marker. Always keep checking to make sure you picked up the right one. So this is the darkest part of this side of the box. So I'm starting there. When your pen is full of alcohol, which is the vehicle which makes this move, the pigment move, it's darkest where you start when you first open the lid. So that's where you should plan to start when you start your rendering as well. It's all very logical. It makes sense. So I'm going to stop now and put in some of this 5. If I don't do it now, it might be too late. It might get too dark, too dry over here, and I won't be able to blend it in. So now I'll go back with the 3. I'm starting to see right not at that edge, but in a little bit. And I'd better just let that be, because it's very wet here. So yours will be very wet too. Your markers are brand new, so they're going to be wet. And it doesn't have to be perfectly flat. That's the other thing. Markers are never perfectly flat. You always see your strokes. So you take advantage of that, and later on I'll be showing you how we take advantage of that and use it to help our perspective as well. Now I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and the top, as you recall, is mostly one with a little introduction of 3 and a lot of the weight of the paper as well. Now what we've been doing, building this up dark here and building this up dark here, is setting this corner up to be our focal point, or the closest thing to us in a way. So we'll continue that when we work on the top. So I'm going to get the top of the box wet with my 1. Oops, not the right ones, my 5, that's not good. So not to worry, I can blend this in with my 1, just make sure. It's often a good practice to keep a sheet of paper near you, of marker paper, and test out just stroke before you apply a stroke to your paper. I had one out and then I got lazy. So I'm just doing a little curve there. And now I'm going to use a little bit of 3 just to blend that 5 in, so it doesn't look quite so strong. Just blend it in here. And I can also use a little bit of colored pencil. You don't want to use a lot of colored pencil, but I can use a little colored pencil. That still looks very dark, so make some more contrast someplace else. That's your other option. I'm going to make this a little contrasty here now, so that the 5 won't stand out quite so much at the top. Now I'm doing this dry, so I'm going to get a little texture, but that's okay. It might help to take some of the attention away from that darker spot that I don't want. I might just run a line down here. That helps to show. Now light gathers at edges, so that's why that's a natural place for us to see those edges. Now the final thing to do is to set up a little bit of background around it, and this will help as well to distract us from anything that didn't go the way we wanted it to. So we just start straight out from your box, and this is more of a parallel stroke technique. We're starting away from the box and coming closer and closer with every stroke. That helped, I think, to set it up. This marker is getting a little dry, so I'm not getting as dark a color as I would if it were wet. Now make sure you try and get the same line across on the other side. Please notice that I've never used graphite pencil anywhere. If you use graphite pencil, it's going to get into your nib and you will never get it out. It will damage and destroy your marker, especially the lighter colors. The darker colors it will, but it's the lighter colors that will really be damaged. So now this is getting busy, but that's okay. I'm going to put you're going to put a border around it anyway. So now that's about as blended as we can possibly get it, given the how wet our markers are, and don't fuss. That's the thing, you can't fuss. You have to stop at some point and just let it be.